Elmasil design. Today we're going to show you the second part in a series of 3 episodes that show how to make, ultimately, a French mattress cushion. We started our first episode with painting, modifying and painting a bench so that it could be used, it was a piano bench, and we painted it with chalk paint, and I showed you how to do some stenciling on it as well, and some decoupage on it. And I said that what I would show in between is buttons. We're going to make our own buttons, and in this episode I'm going to show you 2 different versions of making your own custom buttons, and I'm going to show you some equipment that I have for making a button. This is a button press here, and I'm also going to show you how to make a buttonhole on the machine. Our cushion doesn't need a buttonhole, but I thought because I'm talking about buttons, I'll throw in my techniques for making a successful buttonhole. I know that for a lot of home sewers, it's a challenge to make a nice looking buttonhole. So I'm going to give you a few tips and show you how I make a button. Every machine is different, but you'll see on mine is pretty basic, so you'll see how that goes. So I'm going to bring the camera in close to show you what I have here on my work table so that you can get a better image. But before I do that, I would just like to say that we welcome new subscribers, and if you want to know when the latest episode has been published, then click on the bell, which is the notification, to get a new episode. We post, every couple weeks we have a new episode. I've got a couple projects queued up for the next few weeks, so they're going to come in kind of randomly, and if you want to be the first to know when a new episode is launched, then hit that notification button. And as always, we welcome comments and likes to our page. It helps with engagement. It helps YouTube sort of put us in the ranking when people are looking for buttons. If you find that this video is helpful, then that helps us be found more easily by other people looking to make custom buttons. So I'm going to bring you in close and show you the next step. Okay, so today I'm going to show you how to do a fabric covered button. And first I'm going to explain that the type of fabric covered button we are doing is one that has a shank on it. So a shank, you see, is this little loop that hangs down from the bottom of the button. That's a shank. The other kind of button that there is has holes in it. So that would be a button with holes. It could have 2 holes, it could have 4 holes. We're not dealing with this kind of button. To make a fabric covered button, we're going to end up with a button that has a shank on it. So there are a couple different ways you can do it if you're a home sewer. I have a button press, which is back here, and I'll show you how that works. If you're making a lot of buttons, this is the way to go, and it comes with different, depending on the size of your button, you have to have these metal pieces that go together and go into the press to make the button. But if you're just doing a few buttons, the way to go is you can get in the fabric stores, you can get button kits for doing covered buttons. So this is a pretty old package here from Dritz. There are other manufacturers that do this. They're all pretty much very similar to each other. You'll see on the back they give you a diagram for cutting out your fabric. So I don't think this isn't the button size, so be careful. Look at the button from the front. This is a fabric guide for cutting out the fabric so you know the circle that you need. So a close-up of that, because I'm a workroom, I get a lot of my pieces in bulk. So I can also get buttons like this. This is one side and this is the other side. I can get these in bulk, which is a huge savings over the fabric stores. So if you know a drapery workroom, they might sell you some blanks as well. So here's a close-up. So the top side This has the shank. This side has some teeth on it. And there's another side here that's just kind of a flat disc with some raised grooves. Each brand might be a little bit different, but they're pretty much the same. You're going to have one side with sort of teeth on it, and one side that's more or less a disc with some grooves on it. So on these fabric ones, I'll take a blue fabric. You would take your fabric and you're going to wrap it around so that the teeth grip the fabric, kind of like that. You're going to do that all the way around. And then you're going to take the metal piece after this is all positioned around the teeth. This will grip. You use your fingers to kind of get it in place. But you keep working it. If you have a very thick fabric, you're going to have a difficult time with these hand snap kind of buttons. That's why press is a little bit better. I'm going to show you how to do it on a press, because since I've had my press, you can see I don't even really use these anymore. But they come in different sizes. Actually, I'll show you. These are some smaller ones that I've made. These are little gray buttons. Little fur. So there's a blank. But these are covered, and this is to be covered, the silver. And you'll see that they have the shank on them. It's a little tiny. So I save these. I put them in jars if I've made too many. I'll save them in a little jar like this so that I've got my pieces. So that's one side, and then the corresponding flat side is in this jar here. And that's how I kind of keep some of these smaller bits together when I need them. So if you have a button press, what it does come with is one of these, which is a die cutter for that circle that you're going to use. I don't often use this. You would use a rubber mallet. You'd put your fabric down, and then you'd have a rubber mallet and you'd pound on it. And you can do several thicknesses at a time. I generally don't use these just because I find that I don't do a ton of buttons. If I'm doing a buttons for a project, it's usually an amount that I can easily just cut myself. And that way, what I found on these linen buttons is I needed to go a little bit larger in the circle. So my circle, my pattern was telling me, I'll show you on this one, the pencil line is actually the circle of the die. And when I did that with my button form, not all the fabric was catching in the form. So I went up just like 1/8 of an inch all the way around to make sure that I had more fabric in there. It usually doesn't happen, you have to do that, but with a linen fabric, that often happens with linen. Linen is so thin and so crisp that you can have a little bit more actually in there. So I have it lined up. So this is how it works with my press. This machine back here, this piece of equipment, this green piece of equipment, it's really just, it's a press that you see. It's got this long arm that comes up for leverage. And then when this goes down, you see that there's like a little hammer here that will press these two pieces together to make our button. So it's that action there. That's all it is. I generally do this on the ground so that I can even get a little bit more leverage and a little bit more force into it. But it doesn't really take a whole lot of pressure. I just find ergonomically it's just better for me on the ground. So this side here that has like a hole in it, this one is fixed. This is the side, this is the piece where the shank goes in. You have to make sure that when you're lining these up, you've got them the right sides facing each other, or they're not going to snap into place. They won't lock into place. So the shank goes into the hole section here, and it just drops in there. So I line that up. Get that ready. Then this piece here is loose, and this is what helps hammer the button together. When I have it in the press and I press down, that's going to help put those two pieces together, lock them together. So what I would do is, I'll use this, I'll do it with blue. You just put the fabric in here, and you want to make sure that the right side of the fabric is facing down, and this is because this is going to be the inside of the button. And then you take the other half, which is just sort of a smooth dome that's almost like a little moon, but it's got the cup to the inside. The dome is to the outside because that's the right side. And you just press it down. I just press it and make sure that it's all down there and that the fabric is all coming up around the edges. And I check it and make sure it's good. So when I'm happy with that, then I put, I put these two pieces together, just like that. This goes into my press on the bottom side, and then I press. So I do it about 4 times. It's probably good with 1 or 2. And when I'm done, then there's my button with the fabric. So for this French cushion, we are doing 8 buttons, and I'm going to do a couple in off-white. I'm going to do a couple in blue. But then I'm going to wait because I think I'm going to see where my button placement is. I may actually want to do some buttons that are striped. Sometimes when I do buttons, I like them to contrast. Other times when I do buttons, I like them to just blend in so that they're not so noticeable. So the good thing about when you do a custom button is you can make your cushion or your pillow or whatever you're doing your buttons for, and you can wait and see where the fabric placement is going to be and cut your fabric out so that you get the stripe on your button. Or if there's a floral motif, you can line it up so that that flower pattern is right in the middle. Here's an example of, this is a button that I made with some crewel fabric, and it was just kind of an all-over crewel design on it, but I wanted to make it look like the button actually had its own design. So I lined up that green circle in the center, and kind of looks like a flower. So that was sort of intentional there. I think on the crewel design it wasn't a flower at all, but when I made it into a button I could make it look like that. So here's an example. This is just an off-white button. It's kind of hard to see there. Here's another one. Green. It's just a green fabric, but it also has like a little stripe in it. So it's not always perfect when you're trying to line up where you want things to go, but you can get pretty close. And sometimes you can use like 2-way tape or something in between your fabric and your button form to line it up and make sure that it's going to be in the right place. But I always I'm careful not to have things under between the fabric and the metal, because sometimes you don't know over time what's going to show through. So I try not to put anything in. There's another example of a button that was done with just some thin cotton fabric. Alright, so we have this one queued up. And there's another button. So the other thing, if you don't have a button machine like this, and you're doing a bunch of buttons, or maybe you just have a small amount of buttons, you may also be able to find your local upholsterer and ask them if they, because they're going to have this whole setup, they're going to have other dies for doing larger buttons as well. And you may be able to give them some scrap fabric and, you know, pay them a couple bucks for each button and get some really nice custom buttons that way. I know if people came to me with fabric, I'd be happy to just, you know, if I've got the forms in the right size and I've got the dies, it's pretty quick to do, and I'd be happy to make buttons for somebody that asked. So the other thing I wanted to show you, because on the back side of our cushion, we're going to use these buttons on the front, but we're not going to use these on the back side of our cushion. This is a cushion that's going to sit on a wooden bench, and I wanted to have something that was a little bit softer. So what I'm going to show you is how to make something like this to use as a button. So this is just needlepoint yarn, and it still has some threads on it, and it's going to attach the same way that a regular button would, but when this sits on the wood, it's not going to scratch it or indent it or take off the finish. So it's going to be a good alternative to a button. And I think it's also kind of a nice little hand version. It's a really kind of an old-fashioned look. Sometimes people with quilting would have done it. But it's a good way to have sort of a, if you're doing tufting and you just want something soft, this is nice. And this is a wool, these are wool yarns from a needlepoint set. And it'll turn out different, you know, depending on what thickness of wool you have and how many times you go around. This is sort of it all together, three ply. And then here I separated it out so that it looked a little bit more fluid, a little bit more light than this one. So it's basically the same amount of yarn, but this looks a little chunkier in my opinion. So I've made a bunch of those. I'm going to show you how I made them. And it's pretty simple. So for display purposes, so this is my yarn. And I'm just going to take one strand, I'm going to separate one strand. And a little piece. I'll show you how I do a tie. I'm going to use, I wouldn't normally use a different color for the tie, but because I want you to see what I'm doing, I'm going to use a different piece, different color. So I'm going to take, this is the piece that I'm going to tie the little yarn nub with, and I'm just going to tie a loose circle there. I'm going to leave it open, leave it loose, and I'm going to lay it down on my table. I'll move it down. So it's hard to see, but here it is. Maybe if I put it on paper, that might show up a little better. So this is just a yarn circle that's already sort of pre-knotted halfway there. This is my piece of yarn. I'm just going to hold my fingers. You can make this whatever size you want. If you want to keep it a small little button, then keep your fingers together. I'm going to open up just a little bit to kind of give myself about 1.5 inches or so. So I'm just going to open it up like that, and I'm just going to start wrapping. And you just go up, around and around until it's used up. Then you can slip this off, drop it into your circle here. I'm going to pull this up, and then I'm going to cinch it so that it's cinched in the center. That's cinched in the center. I'm going to take one around one way, and I'm going to take this one around this way, and I'm just going to do another knot. And then I'm just going to knot it again. And then at this point you just fluff it however you want it to look. On mine I might even take them and steam them a little bit. This is wool, so wool relaxes and expands when you add a little steam to it. Just trim up those ends and they'll be camouflaged in there. But that is a great little soft alternative button. If you need something and it's not going to be shown, even if it's going to be shown, I think this is going to look cute if we were to flip it all over and show these little buttons. But in this case, on our bench cushion, these are going to be great for the underside. They're not going to be hard, they're not going to chip the paint on the bench, and they're just going to be kind of soft, and probably won't let the cushion slip around too much. So that's how to make a soft button for our backside, and I've made oodles of them. I've made about 8 because I'm anticipating that we're going to use 8 in our cushion. So I've made 8 in the beige, and we'll see if that's the color that we like. Having just made this one with the little beige center, I kind of like this blue and beige as well. But we'll see what we end up using in our next video. So the next thing I wanted to do was to show you quickly how I make a buttonhole. I know a lot of people are nervous about buttonholes, so I'm going to flip the camera around. Let's get a good angle here. And I'll slide around and show you that. So this is my machine here. This is a machine I've had for a very long time. It's just a very basic Singer machine. It has some decorative buttons along the side here. I'll pull you in just a little bit. So there are some decorative button stitches over here, down here, and there's some buttonhole stitches here. So this is a machine, I have a bunch of industrial machines, but none of my industrial machines do buttonholes. I have to bring out this old domestic machine to make my buttonholes. So a buttonhole has a special foot. If you can see this foot, I'll turn this light off for a second, and you can see it. So this is a buttonhole foot here, and this has some, it's a rectangular piece that sort of slides up and down on the shank. If you don't have a buttonhole foot, it makes it kind of difficult for making a nice button. So make sure you've got a buttonhole foot for your machine. And if you don't, you can get these from a lot of different places. You can get, if you may have lost yours or you don't know what it looks like, go to a sewing vac kind of place and tell them what kind of machine you have. They may need to know the height of this shank here, and then they can get you a replacement buttonhole foot. This is a zipper foot here, so that's a different kind of foot for a machine. And then the other common foot, this is just a regular foot that you'd have on your machine right here. So this is a buttonhole foot. So make sure you have a buttonhole foot on here. And on my machine, I need to have, I've got a zigzag length here on my machine. It goes from straight to zigzag. And so for a buttonhole for me, I need to have it on 5, which is the widest zigzag. And then my machine, this is the stitch length over here, and I need to have it between 1 and 4. I need to have my stitch length at a 0.5. So I've got these dials set for where that needs to go. I'm going to try and do this without the light because I think It might be easier without the flash on it. So when I start, you make sure that that is forward, and on mine, I have a dial here that takes me through A, B, C, D, and those are the 4 different steps to my buttonhole. A is just a bar tack, so it's a stitch that just goes front and back, front and back, front and back. That's all it does. It's called a bar tack. So it just goes front and back, side to side, and that's why you need your largest zigzag stitch, so that you get the widest bar tack on. Then that's going to be the top of your buttonhole. And then I'm going to switch to B, and when I switch to B, my machine tells me here it's going to be a short zigzag that goes down the right side of the buttonhole. So it's going to be a short zigzag all the way down, and then when I get to the length that I want my buttonhole to be, then I'm going to switch it to C, which is back to, basically to the bar tack, and it's going to tack it back and forth at the bottom, and then I switch it to D, and I'm going to zigzag up the left side. So you're basically making your buttonhole within the buttonhole foot. Now a lot of times I will use a pencil, and I will mark my start and my stop with a pencil, or I'll use an invisible marking pen. I don't like to use pins to mark just because they add a little space under the buttonhole, and it can give you some wiggly stitches when you start getting close to the pin. It can give you some wiggly stitches, and it can also make your buttonhole kind of go off center if those are there. So I like to either use a invisible marking pencil. Chalk is usually too bulky. You want sort of more of a fine point. So a pencil, if I can use it. Sometimes I'll even use a pen to mark it. You're going to be going over the stitch, and if there's any pen mark on your fabric, you're gonna, if it's in the center of your buttonhole, you're gonna be kind of cutting through and slicing that anyway. So again, my thing with pins, it seems like I'm very anti-pin, but a lot of times pins are just not your friend. So I'm set on A right now, and I actually have in here a pretty thick thread. I don't normally, it's a sewing thread, but it's generally thicker than what I usually use, like a serger thread. So in this case, this is going to produce, you'll see, a pretty nice looking buttonhole. So I'm going to bring it in just a little bit closer. That's the bar tack. And I just kind of gently push from the bottom. Get to where my button stops. I always have the needle in the up position before I turn this dial. So now I'm back to the bottom bar tack. Now I'm in D, just going up the buttonhole. And at the end, I always go back to bar tack, and I just do 1 or 2. And that way you're set up for your next buttonhole. So here's our buttonhole. Cut the threads. This is a pretty decent looking buttonhole. The key to getting a buttonhole to look nice is, one, to make sure it's all, your fabric is level and flat. The other is to make sure that when you're sewing, you have even speed. You don't speed up and slow down, because when you speed up and slow down, you're going to get bunching in the zipper. The zigzag. You're going to get bunching in the zigzag, which is then going to cause the foot not to move as smoothly, and you'll get a hump in there, which is going to kind of jog things, which just kind of complicates the matter. So, as with most sewing that you're doing, consistency is key. Now, if I were using a serger thread, which I normally do, what I would do is I would stitch this whole circuit once. When I come up to the top, I would actually stitch another buttonhole on top of this buttonhole and go all the way around. So with any normal thread, this one happens to be nice and thick, and I wanted to use this one that was a little bit thicker so that it would show up on the film nicely. So when you're at this stage too, you just take some really sharp scissors, and you're going to be careful to just pierce the fabric. There's a point, one end is a little bit more point. These are tailor's points. And you're just cutting the fabric that's in between. And I cut up to the bar tack. I flip it around. Do the same thing, making sure I'm up to the bar tack. And normally you would use a thread that matches your fabric, so it wouldn't be so contrasty. But at this point, because this is white, I kind of will rough that up. And then I'm going to cut these threads out of the way. Being careful all the time not to cut too many of the actual blue thread to your buttonhole. So that is a buttonhole. Like I said, your thread would pretty much match your fabric. So these little threads here that you see, those would fall away over time. The other thing I wanted to show you is, you may not know how to size a buttonhole properly. The other thing people probably run into is they make their buttonholes too small or too big. So this one, I just randomly made this buttonhole, but I think this is actually a good buttonhole for this little button that I have. So it's a little bit tight, but over time these buttonholes will stretch out the more you use them. You know, if you think about things you get in the store, buttons, garments that you get in the store, the buttonholes are a little bit tight to begin with, and then they loosen up. So if you can see the size difference, so the bar tack is well above and well below the button. So if I'm sizing a buttonhole for a button, I'm going to make sure that I go about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch higher and lower than the actual height of my button, so that I've got that room. See, the button tack is above and below. So that's a pretty good size. This one, you can comfortably get the button in and out. So that's kind of a guide there. And then this would have a shank, so the shank is showing there. But that's a guide to making a button. So I hope that you won't be too intimidated by a button or a buttonhole. You'll make custom buttons. Look up your machine and you know, look for YouTube videos that show someone making a buttonhole on your exact machine. Every machine is just a little bit different, but they're all basically the same. You need to have a buttonhole foot. You need to probably adjust your stitch so that you're in the zigzag mode and that you have a small stitch length. And then You know, on mine, it's an A, B, C, D dial. It's already sort of pre-programmed in here. This is not a high-tech machine. This is just, here's a dial, and you just work through the stages. I know that there are some machines that actually have buttonhole cams, and it's a larger contraption, and you would drop in a cam. I've got a really old machine from the 40s that has a buttonhole cam, and I've never gotten it out to play with it, but you would drop in a cam, which is like a little jig, and it'll give you a keyhole buttonhole, and it just uses this jig, the cam, to sort of get the size of the button, and that would be sort of an up and a down with sort of a little circle at the bottom, and you just, all you need to do, this is my understanding with that button, is you just line everything, you put everything in, you line it all up, and when you start, you just put power to the machine, and the machine just takes you through that whole process. It's pretty amazing. And that was technology that they had back, you know, when machines were first coming out, because a lot of people were using sewing machines to make their own clothing, and they needed to make buttonholes. So some great ingenuity with buttons and buttonholes. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Tune in to the third in this series, where we are going to be putting in these buttons into our French mattress cushion. I'm going to show you how to make the French mattress cushion, and you'll see how these buttons work. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, leave us a comment, and we'll see you next time.